Welcome to our tutorial on adding textures to 3D models. This video will guide you step by step through the process of texturing, enhancing the realism of your models. Let's get started. First, let's discuss what a texture is in the context of 3D modeling. A texture is essentially an image applied to a 3D surface to give it color and detail. Textures can simulate complex details like wood grains, fabric patterns, or skin blemishes. In our example, we will be using a 3D model of a simple cube. We'll texture this cube to make it look like a wooden block, but the principles apply to any 3D model. Let's start by creating our 3D cube model. We will use Blender for this tutorial. Now that we have our cube, let's set up the workspace for texturing. First, switch to the shading workspace in Blender. In the shader editor view, you will see two main sections, the node editor and the 3D viewport. We will create a material for our cube here. Click on the New button to create a new material. With the new material created, let's rename it to Wood Material to keep everything organized. Next, we need to set the material to use nodes. This will allow us to add a texture image to our material. In the Material Properties panel, check the box that says Use Nodes. Now let's add an image texture node to the node tree. You can do this by pressing Shift+A and selecting Texture, the image texture. Once you have the image texture node, we need to load a wooden texture image. You can find free wood texture images on websites like textures.com or create your own in an image editing software. With the image texture node selected, click the Open button in the Node Properties area and navigate to the location of your wood texture image. After loading the texture image, we need to connect it to the principal shader. To do this, click and drag the yellow dot from the image texture node and connect it to the base color input on the principal BSDF shader node. Now, let's ensure the texture maps correctly to our cube. In the 3D viewport, select your cube and go into Edit mode. We need to unwrap our cube's UVs. To unwrap the UVs, select all faces of the cube by pressing A on your keyboard. Then, in the UV menu, select Unwrap. This will create a basic UV map for our cube. Now let's go back to the shader editor. In the UV image editor, ensure the UV layout is visible and corresponds to your wooden texture image. To ensure that the texture appears correctly on our 3D model, we can adjust the mapping. We'll add a texture coordinate node and a mapping node. First, connect the UV output from the texture coordinate node to the vector input on the mapping node. Then, connect the vector output of the mapping node to the vector input of the image texture node. You can manipulate the settings in the mapping node to tile or rotate your texture as desired. For example, setting the X and Y scale values to 3 will repeat the texture. Next, ensure to check that the correct shading mode is selected in the 3D viewport. This will usually be the material preview or rendered view mode to see your textures effectively. At this point, you should see your cube wrapped in a beautiful wooden texture, but we can enhance it even further by adding some additional details. One way to add more realism is by using a normal map. A normal map simulates small surface details which create the perception of depth. Similar to how we added the wood texture, let's load a normal map. Add another image texture node and load your normal texture. Ensure that this normal map is connected to the normal input of the principal BSDF shader. Remember that normal maps usually need to be converted to a proper format. So, be sure to select Non-Color in the color settings of the image texture node. To connect the normal map, add a normal map node. Connect the color output from the normal map image texture to the color input of the normal map node. After connecting it, link the output of the normal map node to the normal input of the principal BSDF. This should add a nice level of detail to your texture. Let's also tweak the roughness of our material to control how shiny our cube appears. You can do this by adjusting the roughness value in the principal BSDF shader node. If you want the cube to have a more polished look, reduce the roughness value closer to 0. Alternatively, increase it for a more matte finish. Now, let's add some lighting to enhance the appearance of our 3D model. Lighting is crucial because it defines how your textures and materials are rendered. You can adjust the intensity of the light as well. Select the light source in the 3D view and change the strength value in the Light Properties panel. Next, let's finalize the rendering settings. In Blender, Go to the Render Properties tab and set the render engine to cycles for the best quality textures. Now that everything is set, hit F12 to render your final image. The process will take some time depending on your rendering settings and the power of your machine. Once the render is complete, check the image to see how well your textures and materials have come together. Adjust any settings as necessary to get the desired look. In addition to basic textures, Blender allows for complex texture techniques such as using masks to add wear and tear effects or combining different textures. You can incorporate a texture mask by using another image texture node that defines where your main texture should be applied and where you want transparency. For example, if you have a dirt texture, you can add it using a mix shader node and combine it with your wood texture to create a more natural look. In this case, connect two image texture nodes into the mix shader, one for the wood and one for the dirt. Adjust the factor slider to control how much of each texture is displayed. Don't forget to save your Blender file. Keeping a backup of your projects will save you a lot of headaches in the long run. Now that we've covered the basics and some advanced techniques for texturing, remember that practice is key. The more you work with textures, the better you will understand how they work. Thanks for watching this video tutorial. Make sure to like, subscribe, and leave a comment if you found this helpful. Don't forget to check out our other tutorials for more tips and tricks.